Welcome to the What If Show.
And man, do we have an absolutely massive historical turning point to analyze today.
We really do. Have you ever looked down at a rail yard and just noticed the switch points?
The switch points? Yeah, sure.
It's just this tiny, sliver of steel, maybe a few inches wide, just resting against the rail.
Right. To the untrained eye, it barely looks like a mechanism at all, right? It just looks like, I don't know, a minor imperfection in the train track.
Exactly. But if that sliver moves just 2 inches to the left, a 1,000-ton freight train that was scheduled to arrive in New York, well, it ends up in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
It's this microscopic shift in the present that creates this massive, irreversible geographical divergence in the future. Once the engine crosses that point, the entire trajectory is locked in.
Yeah, and you can't simply, steer a train back off the rails to where you originally intended to go. The momentum takes over, the destination fundamentally changes.
And that is exactly what happens when we attempt to view history through that same mechanical lens. Today, we are analyzing perhaps the most scrutinized switch point in American history, Elm Street, Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963.
A huge one.
Huge. Our discourse today centers on a really profound counterfactual. If John F. Kennedy had survived that day, would America have fundamentally avoided the cultural, military, and political traumas of the late 1960s and 1970s?
Right.
Or were those historical forces so deeply systemic that they were largely inevitable, regardless of who sat in the Oval Office?
And look, it's a question that requires us to strip away decades of mythology. And to do that, our analysis today is grounded strictly in declassified documents, rigorous historical scholarship regarding the Cold War era, and crucially, and I know we'll get into this, Kennedy's own secret Oval Office recordings.
Oh, we definitely will.
Right, because we're looking at the empirical machinery of his presidency, not the legend that was constructed after the fact. I'll be arguing that the view of Kennedy as the savior of the late 20th century is, respectfully, a romanticized projection.
Okay, well, my position is that Kennedy's survival would have fundamentally and positively altered the trajectory of American history.
You really think so?
I do. By executing already planned military withdrawals and preserving a baseline of institutional trust, a second-term Kennedy administration would have entirely bypassed the darkest chapters of the late 20th century.
I mean, when you examine the geopolitical realities of the 1960s and Kennedy's own deeply documented political conflicts, it becomes incredibly clear that his survival would likely have resulted in similar, if not completely identical, historical struggles.
I hear you, but let's look at the foundation of the argument for Kennedy altering the trajectory, because it relies on one incredibly concrete, heavily documented piece of evidence.
You're talking about NSAM 263?
National Security Action Memorandum 263, yes, often referred to simply as NSAM 263. Look, this wasn't some theoretical white paper, right?
Sure.
This wasn't a draft proposal floating around the Pentagon. This was a formal presidential directive signed on October 11th, 1963. That is exactly 42 days before Dallas.
A document that certainly exists in the archives, yes. I'll give you that.
It exists, and it was active policy. That document explicitly authorized the withdrawal of 1,000 United States military personnel from Vietnam by the end of 1963. And it had the stated formal objective of removing virtually all U.S. forces by the end of 1965.
Right, but...
Wait, just think about the timeline here. If Kennedy survives Dallas, he goes into the 1964 election. Every single piece of credible polling data heavily favored him to win a second term comfortably. So, following that re-election, insulated from the immediate political pressure of appearing, soft on communism, Kennedy executes the timeline established in NSAM 263.
That is a massive leap.
Is it? He avoids the massive military escalation initiated by his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. We are talking about preventing a war that cost 58,000 American lives and an estimated $570 billion in 1960s currency.
The cost was staggering. Absolutely.
And beyond the staggering human and economic toll, avoiding that escalation prevents the resulting total collapse of institutional trust that defined the subsequent decades. The cultural demolition of the late 60s simply doesn't occur in a world where America quietly draws down its advisory presence in Vietnam by 1965.
Look, I understand the appeal of that narrative, but I come at it from a completely different way. Relying on nsam 263 as an ironclad guarantee of peace entirely ignores the immense crushing political pressures Kennedy actually faced.
Pressures he had navigated before, though.
Navigated, but with profound ambivalence. And we don't have to guess what Kennedy was thinking behind closed doors, because Harvard University Press has extensively documented his secret Oval Office recordings. You have to remember Kennedy was a committed anti-communist.
Well, sure, everyone was.
But he firmly believed in the domino theory. He had been brutally tested by the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. In those private recordings, Kennedy explicitly admitted that a withdrawal from Vietnam without a definitive victory would be a political catastrophe.
Okay, but acknowledging political difficulty isn't the same as abandoning a written policy.
It is when the policy is entirely contingent on geopolitical stability. The idea of Kennedy as this inevitable peace president, it's a myth. It's a myth constructed in collective grief after his assassination.
I wouldn't call a signed directive a myth.
But betting on an unknown, untested second-term Kennedy to gracefully and neatly sidestep the most volatile Cold War pressures of the 20th century is a historical, wishful thinking.
Come on.
It is. He would have faced the exact same Gulf of Tonkin incident. That was a disputed naval clash that historically served as the blank check for war. He would have faced the exact same North Vietnamese aggression and the exact same pressure from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to escalate.
That's the part that always trips people up. On one hand, you have his private tapes, right? On the other, a signed document. How do we weight those? Let's focus precisely on that tension between the military establishment and the executive.
Let's do it.
You mentioned the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's crucial to remember that Kennedy had grown deeply suspicious of his military advisors after the Bay of Pigs.
That is true.
He was actively bypassing them. The operational reality of nsam 263 was confirmed by his own Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. McNamara stated unequivocally that the withdrawal plan was real.
Well, McNamara said a lot of things later on.
Though furthermore, Kennedy had privately assured Senator Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Leader and a staunch opponent of intervention, that he fully intended to withdraw after the 1964 election. We have both the bureaucratic mechanism in motion and the private assurances to legislative allies.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the sheer volatility of the international stage? In 1964 and 1965, Kennedy's public posturing directly contradicted those private assurances.
Politicians posture. That's what they do.
He was giving speeches right up until November 1963, declaring that withdrawal would be a mistake. His private fears of a, quote, withdrawal without victory haunted those Oval Office tapes.
Right. He was worried about the optics.
More than optics, you have a president who is publicly committing to the fight, privately agonizing over the political cost of losing Southeast Asia, and facing a Soviet Union that was aggressively testing boundaries globally.
But the directive
to look at nsam 263 and declare that Kennedy would have remained completely unswayed by a collapsing South Vietnamese government ignores how the Cold War actually functioned.
Okay, but should we weigh a president's private political fretting over a signed operational military directive with a concrete timeline?
I think we absolutely have to.
Look at it this way. If a CEO signs a legally binding dissolution of a subsidiary, do we invalidate it because they worried aloud about the stock price to their board? Signing nsam 263 was like taking your foot off the gas. The gears of the bureaucracy were already turning. Troops were scheduled to come home.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why that car analogy actually proves my point.
Okay, let's hear it.
Yes, taking your foot off the gas slows you down on a flat road. But in 1964, the car was on a 45-degree downward slope. Taking your foot off the gas doesn't matter when the gravity of the Cold War is pulling you down.
The gravity of the Cold War?
Yes. The domino theory wasn't just a talking point, it was the governing geopolitical physics of the era. The working theory across the entire Western world is that if South Vietnam fell, neighboring countries like Laos and Cambodia would fall.
Which ultimately proved false, by the way.
Proved false later, sure. But at the time, they believed it would eventually cut off global trade routes and shift the entire balance of power to Moscow. When the situation on the ground in Saigon inevitably deteriorated in 1964, which it did, The pressure on Kennedy to tear up NSAM 263 and hit the gas again would have been astronomical.
Astronomical, sure.
The assumption that he would have calmly proceeded with a withdrawal while watching a geopolitical ally collapse is highly, highly speculative.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it very differently. Because the gravity you're talking about, Kennedy already proved he had the emergency brake.
Did he?
Absolutely. He demonstrated the capacity to resist astronomical pressure from his military advisors during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Joint Chiefs demanded airstrikes, he chose a blockade.
That was a different scenario.
But it shows his executive resolve. When they demanded escalation, he negotiated a back-channel deal. He had the resolve to defy the conventional Cold War playbook. And pulling that emergency brake in Vietnam means he doesn't burn down his presidency overseas.
Right.
He keeps his political capital, which leads us directly to the domestic front. By not spending all his public goodwill on a controversial war in Asia, Kennedy would have had a massive reserve of domestic power, and he would have needed every ounce of it for the civil rights movement.
Ah, yes. The civil rights movement. This is another area where the mythology often completely overshadows the legislative reality of the time.
Wait, but look at the sequence of events. Kennedy introduced the sweeping Civil Rights Bill in June 1963, long before his fateful trip to Dallas. He gave a televised address framing civil rights as a moral issue as old as the scriptures.
Rhetorically, he was brilliant. I agree.
The political will was already building. If Kennedy survives, he runs against Barry Goldwater in 1964. Goldwater was an arch-conservative whose platform frankly terrified mainstream America. Kennedy crushes Goldwater, secures a massive re-election, and enters his second term with a powerful mandate.
A strengthened mandate provides exactly the political machinery necessary to pass the Civil Rights Act. He avoids a foreign war, preserves his political capital, and dedicates his second term to securing domestic equality. The timeline of the legislation remains completely intact.
Look, I have to identify the systemic weaknesses in that assumption, because you have to understand the mechanism of the Senate back then.
The mechanism? Introducing a bill is just rhetoric. Passing it requires ruthless parliamentary warfare. Let's examine Kennedy's historically mediocre Senate civil rights voting record before his presidency.
Mediocre is a bit harsh, don't you think?
It's accurate. He was an intellectual, he was an elite Harvard graduate, often aloof from the gritty, transactional nature of congressional arm twisting. And the Southern Democratic bloc in the Senate, led by men like Richard Russell, held an absolute stranglehold on legislation through the filibuster.
Right, the filibuster was formidable.
It wasn't just a procedural hurdle. It was a legislative blockade explicitly designed to kill civil rights entirely.
But Kennedy was learning how to navigate them. He wasn't static.
Learning, perhaps, but he simply didn't possess the unique, almost terrifying persuasive arsenal of Lyndon B. Johnson. It required Johnson's unrepeatable mastery of the Senate.
The Johnson treatment.
Exactly, the Johnson treatment, literally invading a senator's personal space, towering over them, knowing exactly which post office to fund in their district, or which senator's brother needed a federal judgeship.
True. Johnson was a master tactician.
And coupled with that, Johnson had the overwhelming, unassailable moral force of Kennedy's martyrdom. Johnson literally weaponized the nation's grief. He told Congress, "Let us continue what he began," and used that raw emotion to break the filibuster and push the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 through a deeply hostile Congress.
I know the history, but
A living Kennedy, facing severe and entrenched Southern Democratic opposition without the halo of martyrdom and without Johnson's specific brand of political intimidation, he might have been forced to severely compromise the bill just to get something on the books.
see, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it dramatically underestimates the power of a landslide electoral mandate. If Kennedy crushes Goldwater, he doesn't need martyrdom.
A mandate doesn't break a filibuster.
It creates immense pressure, though. He has the undeniable backing of the American electorate. And by passing that legislation without the accompanying escalation in Vietnam, we avoid the tragic paradox of the Johnson years.
What paradox?
Fighting for civil rights at home while drafting disproportionate numbers of young minority men to die in Southeast Asia. That paradox is what fractured the coalition.
That assumes the bill passes in its robust form under Kennedy, which I strongly argue it likely doesn't, and a watered-down Civil Rights Act might have accelerated domestic unrest. It could have led to even greater racial fracturing and rioting in American cities than we actually saw in the late 60s.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Because there's a macro impact of a 1964 Kennedy win that fundamentally alters the genealogy of American political cynicism.
Okay, where are we going with this?
If Kennedy survives and wins in 64, an entire domino chain of American political tragedies is completely interrupted. Let's look at the Republican opposition, specifically Richard Nixon.
The implications for the 1968 election.
Exactly. In 1963, Nixon was practically a political ghost. He had lost the presidency to Kennedy in 1960, he lost the California gubernatorial race in 1962, and famously told the press in his, quote-unquote, last press conference that they wouldn't have him to kick around anymore. He was a joke.
He was politically dormant, yes.
Dormant and defeated. But the chaos of the Johnson years, the quagmire of Vietnam, the riots, and the subsequent assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, that created the exact environment of law and order anxiety that allowed Nixon his 1968 comeback.
I see what you're setting up here.
If JFK lives, he finishes his second term in 1968. His brother, Robert F. Kennedy, almost certainly doesn't run for president that year against his own brother's outgoing administration, meaning RFK isn't assassinated in the Ambassador Hotel kitchen. The Kennedy dynasty remains stable.
Okay.
Without that specific chaos, Nixon's path back to power is essentially blocked. And without a Richard Nixon presidency, there is no Watergate.
You're drawing a very, very straight line there.
For the listener, the Pentagon Papers weren't just a leak. They were a 7,000-page documentation receipt proving that the government had systematically lied to the public about the Vietnam War for a decade. Without Vietnam, that specific proof of betrayal never exists. Without Watergate, you fundamentally spare America from the deep, structural skepticism of government that defines every decade since. The entire arc of American political cynicism is neutralized.
Conceptually, it's a fascinating chain of events, truly. But I must argue for definitional precision here. Attributing the entire loss of American innocence to Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson is highly reductive. It's just too neat.
Too neat?
Yes. The cultural demolition of the 1960s wasn't solely a product of these specific men making specific mistakes.
So you believe the loss of institutional trust was inevitable?
I believe the underlying tectonic plates of American society were shifting regardless of the executive. You have to look at the demographics. You had the post-war baby boom coming of age, creating an unprecedented generational divide.
Sure, the youth culture was changing.
And you had profound Cold War anxieties, right? The existential dread of the nuclear age hanging over everyone's head. And deep-seated racial inequities that were reaching a boiling point long before Dallas. To suggest that a second Kennedy term would have been this tranquil era of institutional trust is to ignore the historical forces at play.
But those forces are mitigated by how the executive responds to them. A transparent, inspiring executive maintains trust even during social upheaval.
Or, the social upheaval shatters the inspiring executive. A living Kennedy would have eventually had to make agonizing choices that alienated large swaths of the American public, just as every modern president has. Would the counterculture still have clashed with the establishment? Undoubtedly.
Yes, but
Would the economic shifts of the 1970s still have occurred? Yes. Blaming Watergate and Vietnam for the entirety of American cynicism provides a convenient scapegoat, but it obscures the inescapable reality that democratic institutions are inherently fragile. They are always subject to testing by broader societal forces.
I disagree that it's just a scapegoat.
The idea that Kennedy's survival magically inoculates America against cynicism is the ultimate romantic projection.
The mythology certainly paints an idealized picture, I will grant you that. But the structural evidence remains. We can trace the direct lineage of institutional collapse to the Gulf of Tonkin deception and the Watergate cover-up.
Specific events, yes.
Exactly. Erase those two specific executive failures, and you preserve a fundamental baseline of civic trust. Even if social upheaval occurs, which I agree it would have, it occurs within a system where the populace still fundamentally believes in the legitimacy and honesty of their government. That is the critical difference between a strange society and a broken one.
But you're assuming Kennedy would have never authorized a deception, or never engaged in political cover-ups.
He didn't have a Watergate in him.
The very Oval Office tapes we referenced earlier, the very back-channel negotiations during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they show an executive fully capable of operating in the shadows when he felt national security demanded it. The machinery of the imperial presidency was already being built during the Kennedy administration. It just hadn't yet been exposed to the public by a scandal of Watergate's magnitude.
So let's summarize where this leaves our respective positions. My stance is firmly grounded in the documentary evidence, specifically nsam 263 and the internal momentum of the Kennedy administration by late 1963.
Right.
The evidence points to an executive who had learned the hard lessons of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and was actively utilizing his executive breaks to avoid a massive land war in Asia. By avoiding that escalation and by consequently preventing the political resurrection of Richard Nixon, a Kennedy second term fundamentally preserves institutional integrity and spares the nation the profound traumas of the late 60s and 70s.
And my position remains that confusing the idealized memory of Kennedy with the pragmatic, conflicted politician he actually was obscures the inescapable geopolitical realities of the era.
Even with the documents.
Even with the documents, the Cold War pressures pushing us toward Vietnam, the systemic racism embedded in the Senate filibuster, and the massive demographic shifts of the 1960s were macro-level historical currents. A living Kennedy would have been forced to navigate those same treacherous waters, and that likely would have resulted in significant compromises, foreign entanglements, and the inevitable erosion of the post-war American consensus.
Yet, despite our divergence on the outcome, there is a clear area of convergence in our analysis today. We both acknowledge that the assassination on November 22nd caused a profound psychological rupture in the American public.
Oh, unquestionably. The immediate aftermath of Dallas created a unique, hypercharged legislative environment. It's undeniable that the subsequent landmark domestic legislation pushed through by Lyndon B. Johnson was heavily influenced and in many ways accelerated by the emotional weight of Kennedy's death.
And similarly, Johnson's escalation in Vietnam was heavily influenced by his fear of being seen as the president who lost what his martyred predecessor had begun to defend.
Exactly.
So where we fundamentally maintain our disagreement is on the mechanics of history itself. Are systemic historical events driven more by the unique character, decisions, and private timelines of the executive in power? Or are they driven by broader, inevitable geopolitical currents that simply sweep the executive along?
It's the classic tension, right, between the great man theory of history and structural determinism. Studying these counterfactuals is incredibly valuable, not because it allows us to rewrite history to our liking, but because it forces us to rigorously map out the complex, interconnected nature of presidential decision-making.
Precisely.
It highlights how a single military directive or a single procedural rule in the Senate can act as a linchpin for an entire decade.
It forces us to confront the immense weight of singular moments. And this brings us right back to where we started today, that rail yard, that switch point. We can study the sliver of steel, we can measure the track, and we can argue about the momentum of the train all day. The listener is left to weigh the declassified documents against the political realities of the Cold War and form their own conclusion.
And they should.
The historical documents, the Oval Office recordings, and the entire context surrounding Kennedy's abbreviated presidency remain available, waiting to be explored further.
The tracks are laid bare for anyone willing to look closely at the evidence rather than the myth.
So the next time you consider the cultural fractures of the late 20th century, ask yourself whether the train was always destined for that destination, or if a 2-inch shift of steel on a sunny afternoon in Dallas permanently rewrote the map. The answer changes how you view every political decision made today.